I'm going to tell you a story of how Dionysus came to shake hands with Apollo. Apollo is the god of creation, cultivation. You could make him synonymous with consciousness. And Dionysus is something like nature, his expression, raw energy. So the relationship between Dionysus and Apollo is much like the relationship between consciousness and nature. Apollo being consciousness and Dionysus being nature. And there's this weird relationship because we look at consciousness, and first of all what we say is that consciousness in some sense is the top layer of nature. It's clearly part of nature because we are beings which exist. We clearly are things, we are real, and anything that exists is what nature is. But at the same time, we can at least distinguish ourselves from nature. But it comes, you start asking a question, which is, why does consciousness show up in nature? Is there something about nature which inherently moves towards consciousness? Or is it that everything in nature is already conscious? It seems as though there's some attracting principle. It's not merely that nature is flowing on by in some mechanical slowing down process, but it's heading towards consciousness. So what you could describe consciousness as is the self-realization of nature. Nature's there. It doesn't have consciousness, but it has some kind of patterns going on. But of course those patterns can't be recognized without an observer, a consciousness. But there's some kind of cultivation, it's like consciousness is a symphony of nature. There's some complexity, it's not just like a chaotic, disorganized aspect of nature. Nature just moving in a direction. Consciousness is all of the random explosions of nature being drawn together into a form. And why is it that nature somehow moved towards a state where we've created consciousness, which is essentially identical with form? It's as though nature has carved a gorgeous statue, and we're looking at this thing and we're saying, why? Why not rather, a cliffside? I mean, they're certainly striking, but why so much precision? Why go after this thing, consciousness, which is the archetype of form? We have this intensely cultivated thing, which is consciousness, and you kind of ask, why is it there? And it doesn't seem obvious with any particular part of nature that it's moving towards, the self-realization thing, because obviously we're part of nature, we're looking at nature, we think of ourselves as distinct from it, but we aren't, and that's one of the realizations that's most interesting to have. But at the same time, if we are nature looking at itself, why? Does nature need us to look at itself? Are we the only way that nature can look at itself? And the progress of nature towards consciousness isn't so direct. It's almost like something you can only pick up by intuition, it feels. It's like a planet orbiting around a black hole. It's very subtle. There's something drawing nature towards it, towards this cultivated state. But that attractor that is drawing nature to approach consciousness can come from nothing else but nature. Nature exists, and for some reason nature is moving towards this cultivation state. And you can see this, it's similar to the relationship between the gods Dionysus and Apollo. I already mentioned that Dionysus he corresponds to nature and Apollo corresponds to consciousness. To understand these guys, I'll reference Nietzsche. He asks the question of why do philosophers seek the truth? What is their motivation psychologically? And he looks at people like, the metaphysicists who preceded him, John Locke, Berkeley, Spinoza, and they tried to create these systems that would describe reality outside of what we can just see and touch and verify scientifically. There's something that we can use reason somehow to understand the world in a fundamental way. But they all sort of failed. And then they continued down their line. I mean, if you look at German idealism, that is an attempt to complete the task of understanding metaphysics. But if you read any of the German idealists, you'll notice that they are extraordinarily dense, abstract, and it almost seems as if they're playing a game of their own invention, which was Nietzsche's criticism. And he sort of asked the question, well, it seems as though this metaphysical task has been failed, but no one wants to give up on it. So why is it that they do it? What is their goal there? And he thought, oh, I see what it is. It's that nature and reality is too terrifying. The idea that the metaphysical realm is inaccessible to us is not something that we want to accept. But then, of course, Nietzsche, once he discovered that the purpose of philosophy was to create this second world, to justify the existence of the philosopher, he had to ask himself, well, why is it that I'm asking about this in the first place? What need am I satisfying by analyzing the behavior and thoughts of a philosopher? And he had to extricate from himself a particular bias or a certain goal which he might have rested upon, which was idle psychologizing. He could have sat there and looked at philosophers and turned himself into a person who looks into the psychology of philosophers. But of course, that if he had done that, he would have had to finish his career pretty early on. He might have finished in the first couple of publications. And so he was seeking something, because he came to this psychological understanding of philosophy, which was quite unique, but he was going somewhere. There was more. So he had already dispensed with this idea that we're going to construct a metaphysics, and he'd created for himself an account of why it is that others felt the need to do that. But he didn't stop there. So anyway, the point is, he didn't make a principle of psychologizing, because he felt that would be doing the same thing that the philosophers were doing. They were making a principle of metaphysics. And this is where we can introduce the idea of Apollo, where he is the god of cultivation. And Nietzsche described the idea of Apollo as the idea of redemption through illusion. That's a very interesting idea. So he describes the play between Dionysus and Apollo in the ancient Greek tragedy as Dionysus is, he comes along and he stirs up the emotions. He's the god of wine. He's the god of expression, novelty, and life. But always after the dithyramb, the chorus sung to Dionysus, there has to be a principle of cultivation. So it's this systole and diastole, the heart pumps in and out, the blood relaxes and it tenses, it relaxes and it tenses. There's a rhythm. And his idea is that Dionysus is the fundamental part. That's the releasing of tension, the releasing of emotion and intensity. But then there's also the cultivating aspect, there's the cultivating stage, and that they move between each other, and that the beauty of Greek tragedy was the rhythm, that the two forces would move in and out. But it is important to recognize that Dionysus is primary. Now, so Dionysus, you can say, is animal expression, and Apollo is kind of consciousness. So when we sing the song to the dithyramb, we sing the dithyramb to Dionysus. We express our animal impulses. But then after a period, say, of expression of animal impulses, they fertilize the ground for cultivation. So there's a mutual relation between Dionysus and the Dionysian state, and then Apollo. Dionysus invites Apollo. There's something about Dionysus that wants Apollo. But Dionysus is always first. So, I think what we can say is that knowing is a part of truth, which is to say that Apollo is secondary to Dionysus. Consciousness is a subset of nature. So we can't understand truth or nature. We can't understand it, because that would mean to know it, be conscious of it. Nature is just expression. So we can't know nature. Nature is expression. But expression seeks a melody. So nature wants a symphony. So this idea that we can do metaphysics and we can construct the philosopher's stone and we can bring them all together and we'll have the thing, we'll have the actual thing that will justify reality, is a mistake. But what we can have is a melody. We can harmonize, and that's beautiful. So this is what I mean by Dionysus shakes hands with Apollo. Dionysus is here, he is nature, but he invites Apollo, and he shakes his hand. And to live with these two forces of nature and cultivation, and to recognize that nature seeks cultivation, is the stage of philosophy which was inaugurated by Nietzsche. I don't know if it's sufficient for the modern era, but it seems like a stage which needs to be overcome thoroughly.